Let's take a look at 5 cases of prisoners who, either on death row or moments before their execution, made hurtful or defiant statements. We'll start with one of the most well-known cases in the world, Aileen Wuornos. But trust me, there are even darker ones. Don't take your eyes off the screen.
You are watching Final Sentence.
November 30th, 1989. A cloudy morning in Florida. The humidity hung in the air like an omen. On a lonely road in Volusia County, the body of a man was found inside an abandoned car. He had multiple gunshot wounds. His name was Richard Mallory. He was 51 years old. He owned an electronics store in Clearwater. In the days that followed, the police had no clear leads. But what they didn't know was that this murder was only the first. In less than a year, 6 more men would be found dead, all following a similar pattern: gunshots to the torso, partial thefts, and abandonment in rural areas of Florida. Behind these crimes was a woman who would soon become a feared and media sensation, Aileen Carol Wuornos, a former prostitute, homeless, raised amid abuse, neglect, and violence. By age 13, she had already been raped, was living on the streets, and prostituting herself to survive. Her entire life was a chain of trauma, fights, and rejection, until she met Tyria Moore, a young woman with whom she formed an intense, almost symbiotic relationship. Together, they traveled along Florida's coast, surviving on whatever they could and whatever they stole. Aileen claimed she killed in self-defense. She said all those men tried to rape her, that she defended herself as best as she could, but the evidence told a different story. She was arrested in January 1991. Authorities recorded phone calls between her and Tyria, who cooperated with police to avoid being implicated. Aileen ended up confessing to the murders, coldly, without hesitation. She said, "Yes, I killed them. They raped me. They beat me. I did what I had to do. I'd do it again." During the trial, the media turned her into a spectacle. She was called America's first female serial killer. More attention was paid to her appearance than her story. Aileen began acting increasingly erratic. She shouted in court, insulted the judges, accused everyone of manipulating her. She was sentenced to 6 death penalties. She spent over a decade on death row. During that time, she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, paranoia, and psychotic symptoms. She became more isolated. She said the injections they gave her in prison were poisoning her, that she wanted to die. Finally, on October 9, 2002, she was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She did not request a special meal. She refused her last dinner. She only asked for a cup of black coffee. In her final words, in front of witnesses, she said, "Yes, I'd like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, on June 6th, like the movie. Big mother spaceship and all. I'll be back." At 9:47 a.m., she was declared dead. Her case remains one of the most debated in American criminal history. For many, she was a victim of the system. For others, a disturbed mind who chose to kill. But that morning, no one disputed her fate, and the room fell silent.
You know, at 9:30 tomorrow morning, you prepared?
I'm prepared. I'm all right. I'm all right with it.
How?
I'm all right with it, but like I said, remember, let them know that I know that the cops knew who I was. After Richard Mallory died, I left prints everywhere, and they covered it up. And let me kill the rest of those guys to turn me into a serial killer. I know they did, because I was no professional serial killer or anything. I don't know, murderer, or whatever you want to call it.
Let's move on to the next case. Also one of the most well-known on the planet. John Battaglia, May 2, 2001. It was nighttime in Dallas, Texas. The southern heat was still noticeable even after the sun had set. In an apartment decorated with classic furniture and family photos, 2 little girls played innocently. They were Liberty and Faith. They were visiting their father, John Battaglia, as part of a court-ordered visitation schedule. John was an imposing man, a former Marine, public accountant, charismatic. To many, he seemed like a good father. But behind that facade was a history of domestic violence, psychological abuse, and an unhealthy obsession with controlling his ex-wife, Mary Jean Pearl. That night, John called Mary Jean on the phone. He handed the phone to one of the girls. Mary Jean listened carefully. Then Liberty's voice trembled. "No, Dad, don't do it." 1 second later, The sharp sound of several gunshots pierced the line, and then silence. John Battaglia had murdered his 2 daughters. He shot them in the chest while their mother listened live, helpless to do anything. But he didn't try to escape. He didn't cry. He didn't turn himself in. After the murders, he went straight to a tattoo parlor just a few blocks from his loft in Deep Ellum. He asked for 2 roses to be tattooed on his arm, 1 for each daughter. While the ink was sinking into his skin, the girls lay dead in his apartment. When police arrived, Battaglia was calm, sitting and smiling. He didn't resist. A loaded revolver was found in his truck. When asked why he did it, he said it was his way of getting back at Mary Jean. He showed no remorse, just contained rage and a chilling sense of satisfaction. During the trial, he was arrogant and sarcastic. At subsequent hearings, he laughed, joked with his lawyers, and looked at his ex-wife with a mocking smile. He was sentenced to death in 2002. He spent over 15 years on death row. He appealed multiple times, all unsuccessfully. On February 1, 2018, at Huntsville Prison, the day of his execution arrived. His last meal was an unusual combination: fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, steamed vegetables, and a Coke. When they laid him on the gurney, he turned his face toward the room where Mary Jean was and said with a smile, "Well, hi Mary Jean. See y'all later. Go ahead, please." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't cry. He died as he lived, with control, sarcasm, and contempt. At 9:40 p.m., he was declared dead. Thomas J. Grasso, December 20th, 1990. It was cold that night in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The city was already decorated for Christmas, but the twinkling lights couldn't ease the emptiness of the streets. In a modest house downtown lived Hilda Johnson, an 87-year-old woman. She spent her days alone, and although her body was fragile, she still had a lucidity that kept her active. That night, someone knocked on her door. It was Thomas J. Grasso, 28 years old. Hilda knew him. He was the husband of a woman she used to help. She didn't suspect a thing and let him in. But Grasso wasn't there to ask for help. He wanted money. He came in with determination, and when she realized something was wrong, it was already too late. With a Christmas light cord, he strangled her. Then he stole her TV, $12 in cash, and a VCR. He walked away as if nothing had happened. Weeks later, now in Staten Island, New York, he killed again. This time, the victim was Leslie Holtz, an 81-year-old war veteran who had welcomed him into his apartment. Grasso strangled him with the cord from his own shoes. He stole barely $100. He was arrested shortly after. He confessed to both crimes with no remorse. He even asked to be extradited to Oklahoma to face the death penalty. He did not appeal. He showed no guilt. He just wanted it all to end quickly. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection in December 1994. He spent only 1 year on death row. During that time, he wrote poems, gave interviews, and kept his mocking style until the end. In the early hours of March 20th, 1995, he was taken to the execution chamber. He requested an unusual last meal: 2 dozen mussels, 2 dozen clams, BBQ ribs, a double cheeseburger from Burger King, half a pumpkin pie, 2 strawberry milkshakes, half a dozen fresh strawberries, and a can of SpaghettiOs. But they didn't give it to him. They served him regular spaghetti. When the time came for his last words, he looked at the witnesses through the glass and said, "They didn't give me my SpaghettiOs. They gave me regular spaghetti. I want the press to know that." Those were his last words. At 12:27 a.m., he was declared dead. His execution went down in history, not for the murders, but for the final irony. Thomas Grasso died with sarcasm on his lips and without the meal he requested. J. W. Ledford, Jr., January 31, 1992. It was a quiet afternoon in Murray County, Georgia. The sun was slowly setting over the southern hills, and the wooden houses were silent. In one of them lived Dr. Harry Johnston, a 73-year-old retired doctor, with his wife. That afternoon, their young neighbor, James William Ledford, Jr., just 20 years old, came by to ask for a favor. He asked Dr. Johnston for a ride to the supermarket. It wasn't unusual. The doctor had known him since he was a child. In fact, he had been his family doctor for years. But that afternoon, everything changed. According to witnesses and the trial reconstruction, an argument broke out. The doctor accused him of stealing tools days before. The conversation grew tense. At one point, the elderly man lost his patience and slapped him. That was the breaking point. Ledford, furious, pulled out a hunting knife he carried with him. He stabbed the doctor in the neck, over and over. The autopsy later revealed he nearly decapitated him, but he didn't stop there. He went into the house where the doctor's wife was. He threatened her, stole 2 firearms, some cash, and got into the couple's Ford Tempo. He fled down the road. Hours later, he was captured without resistance. He was calm, as if nothing had happened. In less than a year, Ledford was sentenced to death. He spent 25 years on death row. During that time, his lawyers appealed repeatedly. They argued Ledford had intellectual disabilities, suffered side effects from anti-seizure medication, and that the lethal injection could cause excessive suffering. They even requested execution by firing squad. Georgia denied everything. And finally, in the early hours of May 17, 2017, at Jackson State Prison, the day of his execution arrived. Ledford walked into the chamber with a smile on his face. When offered to say his last words, he did not apologize. He showed no remorse. Quoting the movie Cool Hand Luke, he said, "What we have here is a failure to communicate. Some men just can't be reached." And before closing his eyes, he added with a mocking grin, "You can kiss my white trash ass." At 1:17 a.m., he was declared dead. His execution was the first carried out in Georgia that year. John Wayne Gacy, between 1972 and 1978. In the quiet neighborhoods of Chicago, Illinois, an apparently ordinary man moved among people like any other neighbor. John Wayne Gacy, known for his work in construction and his appearances as Pogo the Clown at children's parties, led a double life hidden behind that mask of normality. But beneath that facade, Gacy hid an unimaginable horror. During those years, he kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men. Many vanished without a trace, while their bodies were buried in his basement or abandoned in nearby lots. His arrest in 1978 shocked the city. During the trial, Gacy was cold and calculating, denying at first and then confessing the crimes. He was sentenced to death in 1980. While on death row, he mocked his lawyers and guards, maintaining a defiant and arrogant attitude. His last meal was lobster, steak, and chocolate ice cream. At the moment of execution, as they prepared him for lethal injection, he sarcastically said, "Kiss my ass." He showed no remorse or fear. At 12:58 a.m., he was declared dead, closing one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. Patrick Bryan Knight, August 26, 1991. It was a hot night in Deaf Smith County, Texas. The small community of Hereford was already quiet, but a house on the outskirts was about to become the scene of a ruthless crime. Walter Werner, 64, and his wife Mary Ann Werner, 62, lived there. They were peaceful neighbors, known for their kind demeanor and uneventful lives. No one imagined that night that Patrick Bryan Knight, a 23-year-old, would violently shatter their world. Knight didn't act alone. He was accompanied by Robert Bobby Bradfield, a friend with whom he shared more than just bad behavior. That night, they went to the Werner's house with a clear goal: robbery. But what seemed like a simple robbery quickly turned into a cold-blooded execution. Once inside, they tied up the couple, gagged them, and placed plastic bags over their heads. The beatings were relentless. Mary Ann was killed first. Walter, forced to witness everything, died seconds later. Both were suffocated to death. When the police arrested them days later, Knight confessed calmly. He said it was a robbery that got out of control, but the details of the crime, the planning, and the brutality made clear it was no simple assault. Patrick Knight was sentenced to death in 1992. He spent 15 years on death row at Huntsville Prison, Texas. During that time, he showed no remorse. In fact, as his execution date approached, he started an online campaign, asking people to send him jokes so he could share one as his last words. Yes, he made it public. He wanted to turn his death into an act of sarcasm. On June 26, 2007, shortly before 7 p.m., Patrick Knight was taken to the execution chamber. In front of the victims' families who expected at least a sign of remorse, Patrick smiled. and said, "Yes, I've been waiting for this moment. I'm waiting for that joke that will make me die laughing, but it never came. Pause. I do have one. Do you know what the worst punishment for a lawyer is? To have his rights read to him in Latin." He chuckled a bit, then added, "That one was from a guy in Midland. Goodbye, goodbye everyone. Love you all." At 6:21 p.m., he was declared dead. The victims' families left the room in silence, offended by the total lack of remorse. George Harris, September 13, 1990. It was an ordinary afternoon in Jackson County, Missouri, when 31-year-old George Bernard Harris found himself in the middle of a conflict that would end in tragedy. Harris, known for a criminal record, confronted Stanley "Hank" Willoughby, a man with whom he had previous disagreements related to a collection of firearms. The tension between them escalated to an irreparable point. In an act of violence, Harris pulled out a .41 caliber Blackhawk Magnum revolver and shot Willoughby in the face and neck, killing him instantly. The crime was clear and brutal, motivated by anger and accumulated resentment. Police arrested Harris shortly after, and he was formally charged with first-degree murder and criminal use of a firearm. During the trial, the prosecution presented compelling evidence proving the premeditation of the crime. The defense tried to argue mitigating circumstances but failed to avoid conviction. In less than a year, George Harris was sentenced to death. He spent the next 10 years on death row at the Potosi Correctional Center, where his lawyers filed several appeals without success. Finally, on September 13, 2000, Harris was taken to the lethal injection chamber to carry out his sentence. In front of the victim's family and witnesses, he delivered his last words with a defiant tone. "Someone needs to kill my defense lawyer." At 6:15 p.m., Harris was declared dead. The case left a bitter mark on the community, with the Willoughby family facing their loss without any sign of remorse from Harris until the end. Johnny Frank Garrett. On October 31, 1981, in Amarillo, Texas, a crime shocked the community. Sister Tadea Benz was found raped and murdered in the local convent. Johnny Frank Garrett, then 17 years old, was arrested and charged with the brutal attack. The trial was highly publicized, and in 1982, Garrett was sentenced to death. During his years on death row, his lawyers filed several appeals, citing mental health issues and possible judicial errors, but none succeeded in overturning the sentence. On February 11, 1992, at age 28, Garrett was executed by lethal injection at Huntsville Prison, Texas. There are no reliable records of his last meal. It is believed he may have declined it. Before dying, Garrett delivered his last words, reflecting a defiant attitude with no remorse. "Thanks to my family for loving me, and to the rest of the world, screw you." After his execution, a story became popular that Garrett had left a letter in his cell, allegedly cursing everyone involved in his trial and execution, promising revenge. This letter has been cited in various media and documentaries, but there is no direct evidence that Garrett mentioned a curse in his last words. The case remains controversial, especially due to doubts about his mental health, possible judicial errors, and the mystery surrounding the alleged curse he left behind. James Lewis Jackson. On March 20, 1985, in Houston, Texas, James Lewis Jackson made a decision that would change everything forever. Jackson, 47 years old, lived with his wife Sharon and his stepdaughters in a house that seemed normal but hid deep tensions. In a violent and brutal act, Jackson pulled out a revolver and shot Sharon and the girls, killing them inside their own home. During the trial, the prosecution presented the case as a crime motivated by personal and financial problems, while the defense tried to argue mental health issues. After a judicial process that exposed the gravity of his actions, Jackson was sentenced to death. He spent 22 years on death row at Huntsville Prison, Texas, while his lawyers filed appeals without success. On February 6, 2007, he was executed by lethal injection. Before dying, his last words showed a mixture of defiance and acceptance as he looked at those present in the execution chamber. At 7:45 p.m., his death was confirmed, closing a chapter of family violence and tragedy. There are many cases where prisoners mocked their fate before dying. If you liked this video and want to find more like it on YouTube, please help me with a simple like. Tell me in the comments if you're for or against the death penalty and what you think about these last moments of mockery. And, of course, subscribe to the channel. This is Final Sentence. No imitations accepted. See you in the next video.